I knew the truth since I was a small little boy. I am a product of the system I was born to destroy.
A rebel poet going against the dominant power of the time. That kind of drove me to shout from the highest rooftops. Realize that we have an economic system which alienates human beings from each other. You have to find a way to change it, even in small ways.
Your home was raided by the police. Did it make you angry?
Obviously, it makes you uncomfortable because the purpose of it is repression. During interrogation, one of them said to me, well, we don't fear you. You're a talker, not a doer.
Is the government watching you?
It's watching you. It's watching all of us. Why is your idea of religious extremism synonymous with terrorism? Far more Iraqis and Pakistanis die in suicide bombings than anyone in this country or in the United States. How could a society so absolutely rich in its contribution to human history somehow be defined by the violence that's been imposed upon it? I had a forceful spirit. My spirit's tired now because of the brutality of the moment. Curiosity is your greatest gift. Foster that curiosity and eternally remain curious.
They're calling me a terrorist, like they don't know who the terror is. When they put it on me, I tell them this. I'm all about peace and love.
They say that the human race is doomed, that we have lost touch with our true nature, that the media has corrupted us, and that the planet has no future. I disagree. I believe that humanity is full of hope, and that our salvation lies within each one of us. My name is Brian Rose, and my job is to listen, the oldest method of learning known to man. Each week I seek out individuals that are changing the world, people who are living and thinking in a different way. Their stories will challenge your beliefs, make you question your choices, and perhaps inspire you to change. I never planned on doing any of this, but now I can't stop. Join me on this mission and make humanity something we can all be proud of.
For years, we waited to speak to the hip-hop artist named Lowkey. You asked for him, and he finally made it to London Real Studios, and this gentleman does not disappoint. Highly articulate, highly intelligent, born to an Iraqi mother and a British father, he's been blowing up the scene here in hip-hop since his 2010 Fire in the Boot performance and his more recent one in 2017. Those dates are so different because he took 4 years, completely removed himself from the music business, out of social media. He's now getting his PhD in history. We spoke about neoliberalism. We spoke about the Grenfell Tower fire. We spoke about how corporations and the government are constantly running games on us that we're not really here to observe. And we focus on Trumpisms and terrorisms when we should really focus on what is happening behind the scenes. I treasure my times with Lowkey. He really went off in an incredible explanation when I talked to him about terrorist events in the media, and I really appreciate his insight, his thoughtfulness, and I hope we hear from him again in the future here at London Real. Behind the scenes in the Academy, I'm teaching people how to set up their very own London Reel. It's an 8-week course called Broadcast Yourself, where I show you how to create an award-winning podcast where you can interview people like Lowkey, Ido Portal, Dorian Yates, and I show you how to build a business out of it so you can make it grow. So check that out inside London Real Academy, and here's a little bit more about that.
London Real doesn't stop when the conversation ends. You see, that's when we get started. Because everything begins with a thought, and then comes the action. The London Real Academy is our global transformation platform. Here we bring together thousands of students from over 75 countries. Whether you want to build a profitable business from your passion, or learn to speak to inspire, or broadcast yourself with your very own podcast, or accelerate your life to become a high-performance person, we have the online accountability course and personal mentoring program that will make your dream a reality. Join us, and we'll take your life to the next level, together. Our next accelerator course is starting soon.
This is London Real. I am Brian Rose. My guest today is the London-based hip-hop artist Lowkey. Born to an Iraqi mother and a British father, you began rapping at 12 years old and soon after released mixtapes, which gained critical acclaim for their politically charged lyrics and smooth flow. You would go on to play Glastonbury, be featured on the BBC, and become well known for your political activism. You then took a 4-year hiatus, completely removing yourself from music in order to focus on your education. In 2016, you returned to the scene by dropping tracks addressing the European refugee crisis, police brutality, and the Grenfell Tower fire in London that killed 71 people right across the street from your home. Lowkey, welcome to London Real.
Thank you for having me.
It's a pleasure to have you here. And now, after 4 years, people are going to stop asking me to have Lowkey on the show. So thank you so much for your time.
No, thank you very much. And also thank you, for sharing your journey, which I think is one from moving from, and I hope you don't mind me articulating it in this way, from selfishness to selflessness in terms of your previous life. And I think that sharing that process with a huge amount of people must be a daunting thing. It also must take a large amount of perseverance, but also a large amount of generosity in order to open yourself in that way and kind of expose your vulnerability in that way. And so thank you for sharing that journey. And it's something that I have enjoyed kind of discovering.
Okay, well, thank you for saying that. I appreciate it. I find that the more vulnerable I am, the more human connections I make and the more my life is enriched. So, yeah, and I encourage all of the people I meet and the people that watch the show and our students that vulnerability can be one of their greatest assets. And
I agree. And I think also that one of the most ultimate acts of selflessness is the act of listening. And I think that that is really the birth of so many wonderful things. And it's something that I think, as we've spoken about a little bit before we went on air, is so emphasized, the value of listening. Within a society where everything seems to be at our fingertips, where we have an omnipotent relationship with information, the act of listening, the act of humbling oneself in front of another human being and hearing their story and their perception is deeply, deeply undervalued.
yeah, I say that we're teaching the art of listening here. We've got a lot to talk about, and I want to hear about your history and how you started music and what's been going on for the last 20 years. But I just finished watching a video of you that was filmed on June 15th. And it wasn't a music video. And it was a video where you had these dark circles under your eyes. And I think it's because you had been up until 9 in the morning. And it was the day after Grenfell happened.
Yeah.
And I didn't realize that that was right across the street from where you live. And I was wondering, especially to people in North America and the US and other countries that probably really don't know much about this, not as much as they should. I was wondering if you could tell me about that day, what that was like, and what this whole process has been like for you.
Well, I think firstly it's important to contextualize Grenfell as a tragedy of regulatory bodies that were penetrated by captains of industry. So when we look at the refurbishment that took place on Grenfell and the draping of it with Celotex, the Celotex cladding, which was the equivalent, according to studies, of 30,000 litres of petrol draped on the side of the building. It took place at a time when the area in general was really under the microscope in terms of potentially being sacrificed to construction companies. It's not a process which is unique to the area, but it is a process which is particularly vicious in that specific area. You're talking about a neighborhood which exists on the doorstep of global capital, a neighborhood that exists within a stone's throw of Roman Abramovich's £125 million mansion. So what that means is that you have this attempt to extend global capital and encroach upon the social housing within the area. So according to one philosophical way of perceiving the area, it's a gold mine that's being prevented from being mined, the gold, by people that live there on social housing. And so the important thing is for the area to be regenerated. And so this was something people were active against, the regeneration of the area. However, the refurbishment, we believed at the time, was going to keep Grenfell safe from the regeneration. And so the way we perceived it is that all of the rest of the homes were under threat, but Grenfell wasn't. Now, where that came from, this situation where you have this poisonous cladding, which is flammable, put not just on a building like Grenfell, but also buildings, hospitals and schools all over the country, was originally Kyoto agreements. The British government came out of that committing to lowering their carbon emissions. Now, what they looked at as one of the ideal ways to do that was to insulate buildings, because they saw it that if we insulate buildings, then the energy consumption within the rooms will be less, because people will have to consume less heat, therefore carbon emissions will go down slightly. So what that meant was, at that point, that you had companies like Celotex, who are a subsidiary of Saint-Gobain, which is a massive French construction company. They saw an opportunity to come in and sell this type of cladding, this foam cladding, to the British government. But in this period, they also were able to penetrate the regulatory bodies, and it was something that they were even boasting about. You had Rob Warren, an employee of Celotex, post on their website in 2011 with a blog titled "Celotex Now Enters Government." And in the exact quote from the post, which was taken down, Celotex is now shaping building regulations in this country to maximize profits for our company. And so what that meant is you also had on top of that BRE, which is the regulations authority previously, was privatized in '97, and they became partly reliant on funding from the foam manufacturing insulation industry, shall we say. And so you had all of these incestuous relationships between big business and government. You had Mark Allen, who up until today is actually an advisor for Sajid Javid on building regulations. So what that meant is, in the year of 2014, you had the refurbishment that included the demolishing of a green space by Grenfell, and the replacing of that area with a new school and academy, and also the demolishing of the car park, which was outside Grenfell, which, you know, the fire services said, look, this is going to prevent us being able to have access to the building in the situation of a fire. You had the cladding put on there, you know, and this is post Lacanau fire, which is in Camberwell in 2009, in which 6 people died, and the coroner's report afterwards said, look, you need to address this issue of flammable cladding on buildings, and also you need to retroactively fit sprinklers in these big buildings that have this cladding on. It would have cost around £130,000 for them to retroactively fit the sprinklers in the building. Bear in mind, this is in the same borough when they've just announced the £370 million refurbishment of Buckingham Palace. You can kind of see the underlying issues which are here.
Yeah.
So
at the time, you thought the cladding might save Grenfell, because this is one of the richest boroughs in the country, and the gold mine you're referring to is the real estate and the value of that. So obviously, it looks as if the developers would want to get all the social housing out, build, and at the time, you're thinking, wow, maybe this will actually keep the social housing here and the community here.
No, we were thinking it would keep Grenfell, specifically Tower, safe from being demolished, because the rest of the place, the only reason the council have backed off on demolishing the rest of the blocks now is because Grenfell happened. It's the same as the only reason they've backed off on selling off the library. They've made a concession of that. They were going to do that before they sold off the youth centre. They've sold off the college. The only reason they've done a few concessions, which are only temporary, and that's quite important that people are aware of that this situation is something that's going to come up again and again and again, but what will be different is whether the community has the visibility that we've had for the last 6-7 months.
Okay.
So the point is that on that night, I looked out the window around 1:30 a.m. and saw that the building was on fire, and the fire was spreading in an unnaturally fast way, and went down onto the street. And none of us really slept properly for the next few days. We had bits of the cladding in our hair. The smell was everywhere, and death was and is ubiquitous actually in the area now from that day onwards.
Was it very difficult to be on the streets and watch that happen and know that, like, you didn't know what was happening there, but you had to assume that people were dying? And
we saw them. We saw people calling to us from the windows. I think this is one of the interesting things about London, is it has a history of fires to an extent which is some would say and some perceive to be unnatural. Moreover, the extent to which, say, during the Blitz, when the Germans were bombing London, the Nazis were bombing London, of the areas they bombed, Ladbroke Grove was included, you had this phenomena of people coming and watching the spectacle. And I think that within that spectatorship of suffering, there is a philosophical dilemma. And the dilemma is, when you know that human beings are dying in front of you, is the right thing to do to continue watching it, or to turn away when you know that you're lost in a state of paralysis, and even if you wanted to, you can't get near there to change things. There were people who saved lives that night by calling up to the windows, advising in terms of running the bath. There were not a million, but there were many, many unsung heroes that night. But the point is that in that situation, we came out onto the street and were, in a way, oblivious to the wider superstructure that had created this problem. We knew that there was something desperately wrong, and it has several situations. One of them is what neoliberalism has done to regulatory bodies, in a way making them tools of captains of industry to sell their products. Another point is the philosophical basis with which specific figures in the council view social housing as something, this is a direct quote from the New York Times, something which embeds disempowerment and dependency upon the state. This is a certain perception that is had by people in the council. The other side of it is the culture really that's been created of austerity, whereby you had, according to Lucy Masood, the London representative of the Fire Brigades Union, £100 million cut from fire funding. You had 10,000 jobs cut from the fire service, despite the fact that fire deaths have gone up 20% in London. You had 29 fire engines lost. You had 10 fire stations shut down in the city. And so all of these things, it's like a confluence of issues that are not immediately apparent, which come together to cause absolute devastation.
What were those following weeks and months afterwards like for you and for the community?
Well, I mean, I can't speak, everyone, and it's not that I want to atomize the community, but everyone has a different proximity to it also. Our proximity is not that of somebody whose family member died in it. The people that I loved that died, but it's not the same as family members. It's truly, truly harrowing and horrifying. But at the same time, I think that we need to directly combat the forces which brought this into this situation into existence, rather than us focusing on flagellation or platitudes or seeing this as something as horrifying as it was. Yes, we're in agreement. There is consensus about that. However, what were the direct policies that brought this into being? That there needs to be that level of interrogation on a societal level, rather than us just leaving it at the sides. We have hospitals and schools all over the country that are draped in this stuff, and people that are sleeping in death traps.
So you don't want to just get angry and get emotional. You want to systematically go after what created this thing.
Yeah, and I mean, the point is that you've got an inquiry that has access to between 240 to 270,000 documents, but you've got a police investigation which is employing 184 officers working on it, and has access to 31 million documents. You know, you are looking at 5 layers of outsourcing on that building. This is, you know, the problem is systemic, and this will go up to a very, very high level. I find it absolutely ridiculous that Sajid Javid has not really issued a coherent statement on the fact that the technical director of Celotex, the company that were the last layer of the outsourcing on the building, that were responsible for this cladding, a company that were bringing liable cases against people that had gone on the internet as early as 2007 and said, look, this cladding burns. There's a company called Rockwool who do cladding which is not flammable, who put something out saying, look, this Celotex cladding is flammable, and this is back in 2007, and they were dealing with a liable case about it. How is it that Sajid Javid can come to the front row of the memorial, but yet he cannot actually issue a coherent statement upon his relationship with Mark Allen? That's what needs to be interrogated within this situation.
You said there's been some temporary measures. What do you mean by that? As in they've done this temporarily, they've decided to not sell the library, but you're implying that 5 years from now, maybe there won't be these changes that they're talking about. It's
considered the march of industry. You know, sooner or later, they're going to sacrifice that area to construction companies, the same as they have sacrificed potentially hundreds of different areas in London to construction companies. It's big business. You know, that we are rendered ants in this equation as people that live there, but at the same time, ants do have collective power. So it's ways in which we can kind of negotiate and contradict those waves of power.
Why is that community important? Why are the people that live there and the history, why is that important and important to London?
Well, I mean, Ladbroke Grove has a really exceptional history. You have just a stone's throw from Grenfell, 11 Rillington Place, where a killer called John Christie in the post-Second World War era murdered many people and stored them in the floorboards and in the walls of his house, and even in the garden. He even used a bone as a doorstop in his garden. After that, and the discovery of all these bodies, that house was completely demolished, and nothing has been built upon that place. And that's literally a stone's throw from Grenfell. You have on the other side a stone's throw from Grenfell, the Freston Road, which was where the movement of Frestonia was formed, who actually called for independence of the United Nations as their own state, largely a squatters movement. You of course have the massive legacy of the Notting Hill Carnival, which itself comes out of 4 days of race riots at the behest of Oswald Mosley on the road, which is overlooked by Grenfell, in which houses of people that had come from the Caribbean in Windrush and afterwards, their houses were firebombed by these people, but that was resisted. Kelso Cole Crane, plumber from Antigua, was murdered in Ladbroke Grove, and nobody was ever held accountable for his murder, despite the fact that the racist gangs were quite well known. And out of that violence and out of that rejection of a presence of people that, had roots as being, colonies of the British, Antigua, for instance, the British cut off people's feet and castrated them, Despite this rejection of this presence within their society, there came this massive assertion of Caribbean presence in London, which is the Notting Hill Carnival. So it has a legacy of turning tragedy to triumph, of turning personal tragedy into collective power. And so I think for that reason, Ladbroke Grove has a really unique place in the history of this country and also the history of this city.
So we need to keep it around to remind ourselves of our culture, of the history, and that if we turn this place into, a Canary Wharf and just mow it all down and build buildings, then we're going to lose part of ourself.
I mean, it already has largely. You look at, say, the Mangrove 9 is a very, Frank Critchlow, a very well-known case in this interaction between the newcomers and the state. And, in the place of the Mangrove restaurant, you now have Boom Burger, which is, an example of appropriation by the people from here of a culture of people coming in from outside. You have Falafel King next to it, which is owned by an Israeli, and this is Palestinian Arabic food. So the culture of appropriation, of building on top of it another version, and homogenizing the population, this is a process which has already taken place and has been taking place in Ladbroke Grove for at least the past few decades. I agree, it's something that we should mobilize around defending, but unfortunately I think it's more a case of us historicizing and narrativizing that process than really necessarily being able to stop it in a major way.
Your song, Ghosts of Grenfell, how did that happen, and the video, and what was your thinking behind that?
Well, really, the process that I went through afterwards was trying to find a way to, on an individual level, do something that was cathartic, but at the same time, I wanted to forge a coherence and a cohesiveness within the community in a modest way. But also it was my contribution to a wider trend, which was the pushback to what happened. So where you have public space being privatized, you actually have a counterculture of space claiming going on in the area as we speak. And so I would view that song as kind of a part of it, an attempt to bring distant decision makers directly face to face with in some way those afflicted by their decisions. Because I think as a society becomes increasingly complex, as our society does, it's probably the most complex society that has ever existed, what there then comes is big gaps between human beings and the results of their actions. So you can make a decision today and it can affect someone a year later in a very drastic way. And so it leaves more space to obfuscate responsibility. Now, through the song, we're attempting to achieve something which, in the physical realm is possible, but to a lesser extent. And so really that's what the song was about. And now we're in a situation where 17 Conservative councillors have resigned or been deselected and not going to stand in May. So I think that if you look at the song, and that's not to attribute that to the song, but the song is part of something else, which is a cultural movement, which encompasses many different elements.
And you specifically put the victims right in front, their faces right throughout that video.
Yeah, I mean, you run a risk, in some way that can be seen as a kind of pornographication of trauma. And this is something that I kind of deal with. I think we, in this era, have increasingly pornographied almost everything, whether it's violence, whether it's crime, whether it's wealth, whether it's poverty, especially on where you're vying for people's viewership on YouTube. There is this tendency to pornography things. And so I'm quite conscious of the potential pitfalls of doing something like that. You also run the risk of, people don't necessarily want that done with their loved ones. They don't necessarily want those pictures. They wish it never happened in the first place. So anything you do with it could not necessarily be received in the best way. So I think it's hard, and it's important to try and be as sensitive as you can with a situation like that.
Were you happy with how it turned out?
I would change some of the lyrics. So I would change the lyric where I say this corporate manslaughter particularly will haunt you, now hear them scream, because corporate manslaughter entered the lexicon of this tragedy early on when David Lammy suggested that this is what had happened. I don't necessarily disagree with him, but the point is that legally corporate manslaughter would give impunity to individuals, and it would just be the corporation in this case that would pay a fine. So in the case of RBKC being considered the corporation and then paying a fine, what that would be is the money of the citizenry being paid to the government, and nobody would be held accountable for it. You'd have people like Robert Black, people like Rockfield and Mellon. These people would get away scot-free. when that's definitely no semblance of justice, and that's definitely not something that people in the community would be receptive of. So when putting the word corporate manslaughter in there, I was thinking about it conceptually. I wasn't thinking about it legally, about the legal implications. So I would change that.
You are missing from that video.
Yeah.
It says a lot about your whole career. That's what it says to me, a lot of things. Why aren't you in there?
Several reasons. I can't just simply say it was an artistic, aesthetic choice. I was actually not in the country at that time. I was in Jordan. You know, and the people behind the video, Film Pill, they worked very hard to make it happen. People in the community worked hard to make it happen. But I do think there's also something to be said for the, on one hand, the death of the ego, the death of the self, the perception of, in a way, I think Lowkey, the name Lowkey, is in a way part of that, because I think it's, in this age, we're peddled the idea that there is a permanent version of ourselves within us. And I think I more subscribe to, you could say, the Buddhist conception of the self as something which is not a permanent, set in stone, ego-based being. And so I think the more you can do things which kind of, especially in this age where visibility is, you know, young people are having it drummed into their heads that visibility equals self-worth. I think that finding ways in which to make your points and to not necessarily feed the sort of self-consciousness that comes with all of this stuff, and the investment in the big I am, you know, to be kind of cognizant of that process and feed it as little as possible.
Yeah, it made sense that you weren't in there, and I thought it was very powerful that you weren't.
Thank you.
What do you think when the Queen and the royal family come by Grenfell, like days afterwards? What do you make of that? Because I'm sure you have various feelings about that.
Well, in the immediacy, I was thinking about it from a perspective that the royal family are sent all over the world as courtiers of BAE Systems, and the things that BAE Systems sell, you know, not to mention the fact that the taxpayer,
It's a defense company, BAE,
subsidizes BAE Systems to the tune of about £1 billion per year. That's what BAE Systems does to other homes in other places. In Yemen, for instance, as we speak, that's what this company is doing, and you have a royal family which is in service to the interests of that company. You know, I made a remark afterwards that seems to have been kind of commented on the internet, but I do think that, you know, you have a difference in life expectancy of 20 years between the area of the borough which houses Harrods and between North Kensington, where Grenfell is, a difference in life expectancy of 20 years. You have, as I said before, a refurbishment of Buckingham Palace, which would cost the taxpayer £370 million in comparison to retroactively fitting sprinklers into a building like Grenfell Tower, which would have cost around £130,000. You know, that juxtaposition is obscene. That juxtaposition is obscene.
Did it make you angry?
Of course, yeah.
Okay.
Of course.
And everyone else?
No, I can't speak for, you know,
Okay.
the people. There were people that were happy to see them and welcome them, and
Okay.
you know, that's their right.
Neoliberalism, you mentioned that earlier. I know you have a song by that name as well. How would you define that to people listening who might not understand exactly what you're talking about?
Okay, so neoliberalism is the product of thought that took place in Paris in the 30s, and it was based around the contradiction of totalitarian ideas and collectivist ideas. Originally, it was not what it came to be in the 70s, as peddled by Milton Friedman to receptive politicians like Reagan and Thatcher. In its original inception, it left some space for social security, i.e. benefits, as we now call them. But the way that it was translated by the 70s was it became the tyranny of the free market, as they call it. But essentially, we know it's not a free market when we see that those people are bailed out with government subsidies, taxpayer subsidies. We actually see it is the domination, the market domination of the government. It's the subjugating of the government to the interests of corporate power. And so when we look at the IMF really as an instrument of this, you in '76, the Callaghan government took a $3.9 billion loan from the IMF. It wasn't the first time the British government went to the IMF. You had Anthony Eden in '56 after the debacle in Egypt, and Eisenhower, who himself, it's worth noting, was responsible for the coup against democracy in Iran. He was responsible for the coup against democracy in Guatemala in the '50s. But he, at that point, came to Eden at the time of the tripartite aggression against Abdel Nasser's Egypt and said to Britain that they have to pull out, and if they don't pull out, then Britain won't be able to get the loan from the IMF that they need to stop the collapse of the pound. And so when Callaghan, if we fast forward to '76, took the loan from the IMF, what that meant is that the IMF, whenever a state takes loans from it, they come forward and have these SAPs, so these structural adjustment projects, whereby they say, okay, this element of your state function needs to be privatized, this element of state function needs to be privatized. And so what happened was you had, while Thatcher and Reagan were the implementers of neoliberalism from the political class, the harbingers of doom were Jimmy Carter and Callaghan in this regard, because they paved the way for those decisions by Reagan and Thatcher. And with Thatcher, it led to the selling off of gas, selling off of the railway, selling off of the water, selling off of Royal Mail, selling off of all of the traditional functions of the state to transnational corporate interest. And so what that means is that the transnational corporate interest doesn't have the same obligations to the citizenry that the state does. And it was a kind of neoliberal counter-revolution against Keynesian economics, as represented in Roosevelt's New Deal. And in a way, the state committed suicide in slow motion. And I think that that's the development that we've seen, and that's what neoliberalism represents.
And Grenfell's a product of that.
Precisely.
Right, because the corporates pushed the agenda, the Blair administration wanted to promote building, and the regulations were lowered, and all of this happens. And we get evidence of it 10 years later, 20 years later, with 70 some odd people dying. And now we've got this, sarcophagus there that we have to look at every day.
Well, also people die in silent ways on a daily basis as well. If you're in a situation where, because of government austerity, they've cut, for instance, disability benefits, or they've made benefits subject to sanctions. And so if you're a human being that your direct relation to material reality, to your ability to sustain yourself, sustenance and stuff like that, people die every day in silent ways, and on the other hand of it, you have what is argued by some to be the managed decline of social housing, but also the managed decline of the NHS, whereby you're opening it up for Richard Branson to come and subjugate it in that way. And this is the process that we've seen. We were born into it, people of my generation, but it's a process that we see play out in front of our eyes, and it's about recognizing the way power operates over human beings. It's not just something that is a kind of abstract thing. Power operates through our bodies, through our tongues, over our head and under our feet. And so it's about identifying those ways in which that happens.
And keeping an eye on it, and trying to check it, and raising your voice. And
what it means is that we absolutely continuously have to keep checking corporate power and keeping tabs on it. You look at Carillion, for example, you had them sending out profit warnings to their shareholders, many of their shareholders leaving, but yet at the same time the government were giving them billion-dollar contracts for essential functions of state. So you're talking railways, you're talking hospitals, you're talking about prisons, you're talking about even the military. They were still giving them billion-pound contracts, even while a lot of the shareholders were leaving. You had Philip Green as an advisor to Theresa May and David Cameron on corporate responsibility. It's about an incestuous relationship between corporate power and the state. And it's one of the things that, Eisenhower, for his sins, in his exit speech, he actually mentioned the domination of the military-industrial complex. He coined the phrase the military-industrial complex. Originally, he wanted to say the military-industrial congressional complex, but he took out the congressional complex part of it in the end. But the fact that he wanted to include it in the sentence was an acknowledgement of the extent to which members of Congress were also, as the political class, kind of involved in this subterfuge, you know?
I know these names of these companies you speak of because I used to work in the city as a banker, and I know Saint-Gobain and I know BAE Systems because these are big companies. And so most people never heard of those.
And this is the point, is that within all of these stories, there's human beings whose lives are lost by the wayside, who, you know, the corporate media are not going to want to tell us their stories. The corporate media are not want to focus on this micro example of somebody that has been harmed by British taxpayer money and the royal family being turned into courtiers of this company, what that means in a direct material way. Because this is the other thing with, as I was saying, when societies become more complex, they also become more brittle. But it means that the gaps between action and the effects of the action are far wider than ever before. And so I think that's the place that the poet potentially can step into, to say, well, actually, let me introduce you to this person. You know, this is a human being that in some way has been harmed by something you've done. Meet this human being. So I think it's interesting, as a facilitator of that meeting that the poet can play.
Is that what you consider yourself?
I try to, yeah.
What is a poet?
It's a big question. I mean, I think I would place myself, I choose to place myself upon the lineage of someone like Aziz Ali or someone like a Jawahari, people that constantly saw their role as going against the dominant power of the time. Because you also have the potential to be a sycophant as a poet. You have the potential to be a court poet, you know. And I would rather die than do that.
Can you take me back to Carnaby Street, Real Deal Records?
Deal Real
Records.
Yeah,
You're 12 years old?
I wasn't 12 when I first went, I was 17.
17?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Can you tell me a little bit about that guy?
I think I was a product of a narcissistic society. I think I was hungering for validation. I think I bought to some extent into what I consider a kind of Gilgamesh complex, where the story of Gilgamesh, if you're familiar with it, after the death of his friend Enkidu, who, you know, when they first met, they had done battle physically, but then they developed a friendship. And when Enkidu died, he realized the kind of sorrow of mortality. And so he took it upon himself to search for a way to transcend that human mortality. And I think when you look at and you trace human thought, so many of the things that humans have done over thousands of years of existence, especially following the cognitive revolution and also following the invention of writing, because writing, obviously the majority of human history is read through stone, but writing opened up a new possibility for human existence, whereby you could commit yourself to a page that would exist longer than you in the physical realm, shall we say. And so I was imbued, I think, in some way with this idea that to immortalize myself was to kind of go beyond humanhood. You know, this is something that, of course, I was in no way, shape or form conscious of at the time, but it's something that now maybe I back project it onto myself in my teens at that time. But I felt, you know, a hunger to be heard and also for validation. And so that kind of drove me to, you know, to shout from the highest rooftops about pretty much anything that came to mind with very little critical thinking. You know, and it's actually something that I probably would warn young people against, because visibility does not equal worth. You know, they say that the unexamined life is not worth living, but at the same time, I think that you should give yourself time to really think about what it is that you think. You know, it's like Confucius says, thinking without learning is thinking without learning is useless, but learning without thinking is calamitous.